Good afternoon. I'm Lynn Weil, Director of External Affairs for the Center for Security and Emerging Technology, or CSET, at Georgetown University, and we're very glad that you're here. Today, we'll be discussing how crowd forecasting methods can help us better understand tricky policy questions, particularly with respect to the relationship between Silicon Valley and the Pentagon. But first, I'd like to do a brief bit of housekeeping. All attendees' microphones are muted. And if you're on a computer and you experience any technical issues, use the chat at the bottom of the screen and a CSET team member will try to help you out. Please don't use the chat for anything else just yet. And now it's time for our moderator to get things started. Dr. Catherine Aiken is CSET's Director of Data Science and Research. She was previously CSET's survey specialist, designing and leading all of our survey and other human subjects research. Before joining CSET, Kat was at the University of Maryland, where she completed her doctorate and taught courses in political science and research methodology. Her research explored non-mainstream political action, and she has conducted research for the International Crisis Behavioral Project, Cross-Domain Deterrence Project, and Johns Hopkins Applied Physics Laboratory, and taught at the National Consortium for the Study of Terrorism and Responses to Terrorism. Kat, over to you.
Thank you, Lynn, and thank you everyone for joining us today for this exciting discussion. So I just want to take a second to introduce our presenter today, Michael Page. Michael is a research fellow at CSET, where he is the project lead for Foretell, CSET's crowd forecasting platform. He has led or contributed to several other research projects here at CSET. But before joining CSET, he was a policy and ethics advisor at OpenAI. Even before then, before he got interested in focusing on artificial intelligence, he was a litigation associate at Williams & Conley, a staff attorney at Public Citizen Litigation Group, and an adjunct professor at American University Washington College of Law. Michael received a JD from Cornell Law School. I've had the honor to work with Michael on Foretell and other projects here at CSET, including designing and distributing a survey of AI professionals, asking about their views on working on projects with the U.S. Department of Defense. I always look forward to his original ideas, his thoughtful input, and his rigorous approach to research. With that, I'm excited to hand it over to Michael to present his latest and greatest work on forecasting the future of the DOD-Silicon Valley relationship.
Thank you, Kat and Lynn, and for everyone joining us this afternoon. Okay, so I'm going to discuss the motivations, methodology, and results of a project designed to incorporate crowd forecasting into a policy debate on a big question. What is the future of the relationship between the U.S. Department of Defense and Silicon Valley? As Kat mentioned, I'm the project lead for Foretell, a joint project between CSET and Cultivate Labs, where registered forecasters can submit quantitative forecasts on questions relevant to technology security policy. This is what Foretell looks like. Just like the stock market tracks the future value of companies, including how events affect their valuation, Foretell tracks the likelihood of geopolitical, cultural, and economic events relevant to policymakers. We've been active since about June 2020 and currently have over 2,000 registered forecasters. The forecasts are publicly accessible. You don't have to register to view them. And we have two types of questions on Foretell. And I promise this is relevant to the actual findings that we'll review in a moment. Binary questions ask about the probability an event will occur. For example, whether China will seize a Taiwanese feature in the South China Sea in the next 6 months. Forecasters submit a 0 to 100% probability. We average that probability, and you can see how that number changes over time. Time series questions provide historical data on a trend and ask about the future path of that trend. In this case, the combined revenue of the big tech companies. For these questions, forecasters submit a point estimate. The value forecasters believe is equally likely to be above and below the actual value at an 80% prediction interval. The range of values forecasters believe will contain the actual value 80% of the time. Foretell employs the wisdom of the crowd, the collective judgment of a large, diverse group, which is supported by a strong evidence base. The wisdom of the crowd works because everyone brings different relevant information to the table. When we aggregate everyone's views, the signal, the true relevant information tends to shine through, and the noise, such as our biases, tend to cancel out. But let's zoom out for a moment. Crowd forecasting is a member of a large and growing family of probabilistic forecasting tools that employ combinations of human judgment and quantitative modeling. Which tool is best varies by context. And no doubt we will continue to discover better variations on these methods. What they all share in common is that we can empirically evaluate them. We can run trials to identify precisely how good each method is and under what circumstances they fare best. IARPA, which is why I included the little IARPA logo here, the U.S. Intelligence Advanced Research Projects activity, has been doing exactly this. It's run multiple forecasting tournaments to identify which methods perform best under various circumstances. From 2010 to 2014, it ran a tournament to identify effective forecasting methods on geopolitical questions. The Good Judgment Project, icon on the bottom left, using a version of the wisdom of the crowd, won every year, even outperforming intelligence analysts with access to classified information. So here's our situation. We have a rich competitive ecosystem of empirically verifiable probabilistic forecasting tools that have to improve to survive. These tools will only get better. How can we incorporate them into the policymaking process? Because, to quote New America's Peter Skoblik and Good Judgment co-founder Phil Tetlock, who've done a lot of the groundbreaking work in this space, every policy is a prediction, whether about the effect in action, such as the effect of an export control on an industry, or more generally about how the landscape will change, such as the geopolitical dynamics in Southeast Asia. It stands to reason that better forecasting tools will lead to better policy. But probabilistic forecasting tools have yet to find a regular home in the policymaker toolkit. I see two primary obstacles. One is nicely captured by Phil Tetlock and his colleagues on the right, to paraphrase. Policymaking involves big questions, and big questions are not directly forecastable. To be forecastable, a question has to be specific. It has to be a question that we can identify in advance whether the outcome will be right or wrong. The other is that a quantitative forecast by itself lacks context. If a policymaker or you hear that there's a 7% chance of conflict in the South China Sea in the next 6 months, how should they or you react? Is that higher or lower than you previously believed? What are the broader implications? To address these obstacles, we've trialed a method to incorporate crowd forecasting into a policy debate. We begin with a debate between what we're calling stakeholders, the experts and policymakers at the proverbial table, on a big question. Our big question was, what is the future of the DOD-Silicon Valley relationship? We selected this question because it's one on which experts have conflicting, and to others, black box intuitions. And we were interested in whether probabilistic forecasting could help us understand and chip away at the sources of disagreement. We then break the big question down into forecastable components. We want the breakdown to track how the stakeholders think about the question. So we interviewed them. In effect, the stakeholders are deciding what to forecast, and the crowd is providing the actual forecasts. But before involving the crowd, we asked the stakeholders to submit their own forecasts. The purpose of the stakeholders' forecasts is to provide the so what context for the crowd's forecasts. What do the stakeholders believe? Where do they disagree? And where are they particularly uncertain? Because that's where the crowd can add the most value. And finally, we pumped the questions to the crowd. As of today, nearly 400 forecasters have submitted over 2,800 forecasts on the questions for this project. Here's our breakdown. The stakeholders on the left are current or former employees of DoD, industry, and academia with a professional interest in this topic. These are the people that we imagine might be embroiled in a policy debate on what is the future of this question. Based on the stakeholder interviews, we broke the question down into 6 geopolitical, cultural, and economic factors that they believe affect the DoD-Silicon Valley relationship, and 2 measures of the state of the relationship. And I won't bother reading all of these, but there are many of the ones you might expect. Now, this is jumping ahead a bit, but the colors indicate the relationship between the factors and the DoD-Silicon Valley relationship, according to the stakeholders. The factors and outcome measures are too general to forecast directly, so we had to further break them down into forecastable metrics, events or trends that partially capture the factor or outcome measure. Here are a few examples. In the end, we had 19 metrics to forecast, which were a mix of binary and time series questions. We surveyed the stakeholders about their overall expectations for where the DoD-Silicon Valley relationship will be in 5 years. And based on those responses, we divided the stakeholders into 2 roughly equally sized cohorts. The improved cohort are the stakeholders who believe the relationship will be better in 5 years. The same worse cohort are the stakeholders who believe the relationship will be the same or worse in 5 years. What accounts for the cohort's different expectations? Sources of overall disagreement on the big question can appear here in 2 places. The effect a factor has on the relationship. For example, will a more aggressive China improve or worsen the relationship? And second, the expectations for the forecastable metrics. For example, how likely is China to become more aggressive, such as by shooting at another country's vessel in the South China Sea? To find factor disagreements, that's the first class, we surveyed the stakeholders on how changes, increases and decreases of the factors would affect the DoD-Silicon Valley relationship. They generally agreed about whether an increase in a factor would, if it would have any effect, have a positive or negative effect on the relationship. The most significant factors, according to the stakeholders, are China military aggression and Silicon Valley protests. For China military aggression, for example, 59% believe an increase would have a strong positive effect on the relationship, and 82% believe strong or just regular positive effect. The big exception here is the strength of the US tech sector. Nearly equal numbers of stakeholders believe a stronger US tech sector would improve and worsen the relationship, which is a surprising finding. When we looked at responses by cohort, we saw some patterns. Most notably, on the contested strength of the US tech sector factor, we found that all of the stakeholders who believe an increase would have a positive effect on the relationship are in the improved cohort. Nobody in the same worse cohort has that view. And the correlation for that difference is reasonably strong for the sample size. We saw weaker correlations on a couple other factors. For example, 70% of the improved cohort believes an increase in China military aggression would have a strong positive effect, compared to only 43% of the same worse cohort. And 90% of the improved cohort believes an increase in Silicon Valley protests would have a negative effect on the relationship, compared to 57% of the same worse cohort. These are examples of factor disagreements. They're not disagreements that the crowd can help arbitrate. but being aware of them can still help focus the debate, and understanding them is necessary to figure out what the crowd's forecasts mean. Here are a few examples of statistically significant forecast disagreements. This metric tracks the percentage of US residents with low confidence in the military based on an annual Gallup poll. It's one of 3 metrics for the US distrust in military or government factor. As you can see, the same worst cohort's forecast is higher. And this is consistent with the cohort's overall expectations for the relationship, meaning if they're correct, the effect on the overall relationship would be negative. So this is an example of a disagreement that we have some reason to believe matters to the big picture. But now we can invoke the wisdom of the crowd. And in this case, the crowd agrees with the same worst cohort. Consider the crowd forecast by itself. All we would know is that the percentage is expected to stay roughly the same. The practical takeaways would be unclear. The stakeholders' forecasts here provide the so what context that would otherwise be missing. Here are all 3 metrics for that factor, the US distrust of military and government. In this broader context, a pattern begins to emerge. First, we see consistency within the factor. The same worst cohort's forecast is higher on 2 of the 3 metrics, with no real difference between the cohorts and the 3rd metric. Second, we see the consistency between the cohorts' forecasts and their overall expectations for the relationship, meaning again, if the same worst cohort is correct, the effect on the relationship would be negative. Third, we see consistency of the crowd's views. The crowd is closer to the same worst cohort on both metrics where the cohorts diverge. This metric tracks the annual revenue of the big tech companies and is one of 3 metrics for the strength of the US tech sector factor. As you can see, the improved cohort's forecast is higher. And the crowd again agrees with the same worst cohort. Here are all 3 metrics for the strength of the US tech sector factor. We again see consistency within this factor. The improved cohort's forecasts are higher for all 3 metrics. But because the stakeholders here disagree about how variations in this factor would affect the relationship, we can't straightforwardly assess consistency between the cohort's forecasts and their overall expectations for the relationship. The crowd's views are mixed, coming in closer to the same worst cohort on 1 metric and the improved cohort on the other 2. In fact, quite a bit above both cohorts. This metric tracks the annual dollar value of contracts between the big 5 tech companies and DoD. It's one of 3 metrics for the transactions outcome measure. Here we find a large statistically significant difference. And again, it's consistent with the cohort's overall expectations. The improved cohort forecasts more contracts, which would correspond to a better DoD-Silicon Valley relationship. The crowd's forecast is, again, closer to the same worst cohort, although I promise this is not always the case. Arbitrating disagreements between the 2 cohorts is not the only use case for the crowd's forecast. Individual stakeholders can also spot where they have outlier views they should consider adjusting. This metric tracks the likelihood China shoots at another country's vessel in the South China Sea in the next 6 months, and is one of 4 metrics for the China military aggression factor. We didn't see any real differences between the two cohorts for this metric, and indeed for most of the metrics for the China military aggression factor. But we can see that the stakeholders' views vary considerably. The stakeholders at the extremes, over 40% or below 2% might have good reasons for their outlier expectations. But studies have shown that adjusting one's expectations toward the crowd consensus typically leads to more accurate forecasts. And here's a summary of some of our findings. I previously highlighted several statistically significant disagreements. Most disagreements were not by themselves statistically significant, a high bar with 17 data points. But collectively, they tell a coherent story. Forecast disagreements were generally consistent across all metrics relating to the same factor, meaning if the improved cohort was higher on one, it tended to be higher on all of them. And the direction of the disagreement was nearly always consistent with the cohort's overall expectations, meaning if the stakeholders believe an increase in that factor would benefit the relationship, the improved cohort's forecasts tended to be higher. So where do we go from here? With the right infrastructure, a method like this could be incorporated into high-stakes policy decisions. For example, imagine it's May 2019, and policymakers are debating whether to put Huawei on a trade blacklist. And they can break down the disagreement into specific forecasts, such as the effect it would have on Huawei's revenue, or on the revenue of the US equipment manufacturers that do business with it. These are questions that can be outsourced to whichever probabilistic forecasting tool has been shown to be most accurate for questions of this type. And I mention this example because I recall seeing a New York Times article in January 2020 about surprise regarding the effect of export controls on Huawei, and thinking, those are the kinds of surprises we can and should minimize. And if we can find ways to leverage the arsenal of probabilistic forecasting tools at our disposal, we will make fewer policy decisions with unintended consequences. A report describing these findings in more detail will come out this month. You can also read more about all of the underlying forecast questions on CSET-foretell.com. Thank you all for joining and for your interest in this project.
Thank you, Michael, for that great presentation and for all that very interesting information that we now are going to hopefully try and dig into a little more with some Q&A. So I have several questions, but I would love to actually open it up to the audience and participants at the webinar. If you want to contribute any questions or ask anything to Michael, please drop it in the chat now or in the remainder of the webinar, and we will collect it and try to get to your question in turn. As participants are adding any questions they might have to the chat, I'm hoping to ask you a kind of big level question. And I want to start by saying that I'm really excited by the potential of this approach and in this kind of truly mixed methods way of looking at both kind of expert opinion and expert perspectives, and using that to break down these big questions into kind of observable metrics, and then turning to the crowd to see how they might be able to inform trends in these metrics or relationships between these metrics or the impacts that these metrics might have on these kind of big questions. So I'm really excited by the potential of this project and the work that's been done to date. But I want to ask a very high level question, and that is, who is the audience for this approach, or who can actually take this approach, and using it, what is the new information that they get? What is kind of the key new thing or takeaway that this approach provides to them?
So I think there are three audiences or potential audiences that I'm interested in reaching. The primary audience is the stakeholders themselves. And I hope they get a few things out of this. One is a better understanding of how each other thinks about the question. In the interviews, a lot of really interesting considerations came up that might not have been surfaced in the ordinary course. When we're trying to make a big question amenable to quantitative tools, we have to be very specific. And that requirement often unearths differences that otherwise would not have been noticed. So for example, there were, when we're trying to figure out what type of metric should inform the personnel outcome measure, we found that there were lots of disagreements about who between senior leadership, management, and rank and file software engineers, whose views are driving the dynamic. And there are also lots of disagreements about the importance of the big tech companies versus smaller tech companies, and that obviously informs what we're measuring. And so the measurement bar forces that kind of specificity that can help figure out what do people actually believe. We also saw the survey yielded interesting factor disagreements, such as the different views about the effect the U.S. tech sector, the strength of the U.S. tech sector has on this relationship. That might warrant its own focus. And so having, I think this process can yield a more focused debate that zeroes in on points of disagreement. Second is, as I mentioned, stakeholders can identify where they have outlier expectations. And this is not to disparage the stakeholders at all. I mean, we all have lots of intuitions about various trends that inform our big picture views on questions. And we don't individually have the time to investigate the bases of all of them. And so when we ask people to unpack them and put numbers on them, they might not know where their expectations for likelihood of conflict in South China Sea are very unusual relative to their colleagues and relative to the crowd. And so allowing us to identify where their expectations might not be well calibrated, hopefully will lead people to, it'll help them. It'll be a tool that allows them to update their views at a granular level in a way that hopefully will feed up into their big picture worldview. And obviously, if everyone did that, I mean, if we had, so the crowd forecast in this context is a kind of common knowledge. And if we have good sources of common knowledge, we can throw into a debate that can anchor people's expectations, and they adjust their expectations toward those points of common knowledge, overall disagreement will go down. And so we're hoping this will be an uncontroversial, not politicized tool that can reduce overall disagreement. And the third thing for the stakeholders is I think this helps them give surprising developments in their world, their due weight. So it's a common bias to interpret changes in the world as expected developments, which means we don't make broader adjustments to our worldview in light of them. So I imagine if every time an event happened in the news, for example, China's recent hypersonic tests or the recent record number of Chinese military flights into Taiwan's air defense identification zone, if I could read these things and not just move on with my day, but if instead I'd sat down a week earlier, forecasted their likelihood, and thought about what the broader implications would be if these things happened, it would make it easier for me then to make the appropriate adjustments as I read these things in the news. And so here we've created a snapshot of what people believe. And we can see that if all of these trends start to go off the rails, that this is in fact surprising to people. We know it's surprising to people because we have their forecasts. And we also have some reason to, we know a bit about what the broader implications are. We know the effect they think these trends have on the DOD-Silicon Valley relationship. So hopefully it allows us to keep our worldview better tethered to the observable facts in the world that we can see. I'm also, of course, interested in the broader community of policymakers and analysts. I personally find that one of the best ways to really understand a topic is to understand where the experts disagree. And so creating a map of where experts disagree, for me, is a great way to get into the weeds, hone in on what matters, figure out where my own intuitions diverge from theirs. And so hopefully this is a step in that direction. And that's one of the reasons why this the report that will be coming out focuses so much on cohort disagreements. I think if we were just giving this set of results to the stakeholders, the cohort disagreements would matter less, because each individual stakeholder can adjust their expectations on each metric in light of the crowd's forecasts as they see appropriate. But for the external community, having a kind of a macro lens on what is sort of driving this disagreement is a hook for people to understand what the takeaways are. And then, of course, lastly, people thinking about better decision-making processes in government. I mean, the world is rapidly developing better and better analytical tools, including forecasting tools, but many of the most important decision-making processes just don't involve any of them. And this is something I feel passionate about. I think a lot of the reticence is this view that the big picture predictions that experts and policymakers engage in, which is typically qualitative in nature, simply can't be reduced to something we can measure. And I agree that we cannot reduce everything that matters into metrics. But I think that quantitative analytical processes could play a much larger role in decision-making.
Absolutely. I think we're on the same page there, but I definitely want to touch on come back to at least the cohort disagreement and why that's so important and how that plays a role in this whole process. But earlier you mentioned about the crowd as kind of a stand-in for common knowledge. And I'm wondering if we could dig in a little bit on what we mean by the crowd. So could you, kind of get into some of the specifics about how you defined the crowd, or how on Foretell you defined the crowd? And then relatedly, does the size of the crowd matter for any of this? How many forecasters we actually have providing forecasts on some of these metrics, does that matter? So kind of selection of the crowd and then size of the crowd, if you could speak to that.
Yeah, so composition of the crowd matters a lot. So there are a bunch of things to say here. One is, crowds work best on some questions, questions where relevant information is widely dispersed, because the crowd's superpower is that it kind of scrapes up all the different information around the world and it aggregates it. And so if we're talking about a question where all the relevant information is in a classified document, the crowd's not going to add much value. Also, for that reason, a large crowd is better than a small crowd. A large diverse crowd, which has access to different information, is better than a large less diverse crowd. There are also two entirely independent skills that are important for a crowd. One is subject matter knowledge, and usually the experts will dominate the crowd in terms of subject matter knowledge. But we still want the crowd to understand the basic subject matter. But the other independent skill is forecasting. And this is where I think the crowd can help experts, because many experts are still not accustomed to thinking about, like, what are the best base rates? What are the reference classes I can use here? How can I combine them? And the people that are forecasting every day are really good at doing that. And in many cases, just coming up with the best reference classes is the best way to find the right order of magnitude for a forecast. And so that's an important skill. So we obviously want forecasters who are experienced. We offer trainings to our forecasters. So at Foretell, we've tried to develop a large, diverse group of well-trained forecasters who are interested in this subject matter. We certainly have some data on the accuracy of our crowd, and I think it looks pretty good. We have a couple posts on that. But we're also really trading on the evidence here that this method works. But I really don't want the merits of this process to rise and fall on whether this particular crowd seems right for this particular question, because we can sub in any probabilistic forecasting tool for the Foretell crowd in this process. And what is special about these tools is we can measure how good they are in different contexts. So we have the ability to pick whatever type of crowd or whatever type of combination of quantitative and qualitative forecasting methods works best in a certain context, and we can just plug that into that part of the process.
So a kind of maybe specific question, but one that's of interest here is you're talking a lot about how important it is to kind of have a diverse group of forecasters who maybe are bringing to the table different information or different perspectives to be able to, get this more kind of inclusive common knowledge. And is there a way in which we can think about forecasting, either on Foretell or on other platforms to make sure we're kind of capturing some of the views for people who might not be in this kind of group of registered, kind of vetted, well-trained crowd forecasters? How could we maybe be taking into account some of those other viewpoints that people maybe aren't engaged in the crowd forecasting platform?
Yeah, so I mean, I think we found, so the size, so my dream is that there's a massive forecasting project. So anybody at the U.S. government who can make this happen, this is what I want to happen. That has 100,000 forecasters from all over the world, different backgrounds, and we can figure out what part of that pool of forecasters is most useful to capture for a particular question, and it varies in predictable ways. So we've worked a lot with Cosmic Bazaar, a forecasting platform with the UK government, and we've cross-posted questions, in part because we're curious where our forecaster pools will diverge. And the pattern is kind of predictable. When questions are about, and we had a question about the percentage of people in the US who would have negative views about China. And the forecast diverged quite a bit because it's a question about the US, like US views. And unsurprisingly, people in the UK have different, obviously our forecaster pool is heavily US centric, not entirely. We have forecasters from all over the world, but still more US centric than the UK's forecasters. And so we saw a divergence there. And so we should expect that for a question about US views, if we have a pool of forecasters from the US, they're going to have correlated biases, and correlated biases are basically what we want to get rid of. So with a large enough forecaster pool, I think we could spot the need to have people from all over the world for a particular question and make that happen, or people from different industries, or whatever the possible bias might be for a particular question.
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm hoping I kind of want to zoom back out now. I'm back to my high level questions, if that's okay. Sure. And I'm curious if kind of you started out with talking about policies of prediction, and so, but forecasting a kind of specific scenario, like what will the relationship between DOD and Silicon Valley be in 5 years? That's a different. It's different to predict or forecast that scenario compared to trying to predict or forecast an effect that a policy might have. So how can this process, specifically the kind of taking the disagreements that you find and using the crowd to speak to those disagreements or inform, potentially find out how the disagreement, maybe who is more right in that disagreement, how does that help? What are the implications of that for policymaking and potentially, assessing risk and other things around these issues?
Yeah. So, I mean, the goal here is for this process to be decision relevant. In some contexts, I think general scenario predictions about, whether China's ambitions are global or regional are in fact driving a lot of strategic disagreements. And so being able to forecast those things is useful. But ultimately, I think forecasting the effect of specific actions is essential. I think in most acute decision contexts, that's going to be where the rub is. And we can forecast those. So we can forecast those in a couple ways. The most straightforward way is conditional forecasts. So if we're, to go back to the Huawei example, if you imagine a bunch of policymakers sitting around a table arguing about whether they should put Huawei on the blacklist, And some think that this will have no effect on Huawei's bottom line because they'll find other ways to get their manufacturing equipment. And other people think no, in fact, it will have an effect. So we can ask people, what will Huawei's revenue be next year, conditional on it being on the blacklist and conditional on it not being on the blacklist. And the difference between those forecasts is what the crowd thinks that the effect of that policy would be. There are some decisions where it's difficult to use conditional forecasting in that way. And there are a bunch of kind of creative new methods to get around that. So somebody I work with quite a lot, Ezra Carter, has come up with a system called reciprocal scoring. I won't get into that now, but I think that's probably the most promising way to actually get forecasts to inform decisions that are being contested.
Great. So I'm hoping to move into what the topic of the actual kind of issue that we were trying to get at here with this process of the kind of case study of the relationship. And so I'm curious, when you were going through the stakeholder forecasts and finding areas of disagreement, and then going through the crowd's forecasts and kind of breaking down this question into its component parts, what did you think was the most kind of telling part of this process? Was it or useful part of the process? Was it the breaking down of the question? Was it kind of identifying the disagreement within the stakeholders? Was it comparing the stakeholders to the crowd? Which part do you think had the most value add to you, or potentially to policymakers or decision makers?
So I think that to make a big question forecastable, a bunch of work has to be done. And so I think the requirement of making something forecastable keeps us honest in what we're trying to do. We have to think about our views and communicate our views in a way that's measurable and falsifiable. So the forecasting kind of carrot, I think yields a lot of value that is ultimately independent of the actual forecasts. So I was talking with Charlie Edwards, who runs the UK's Cosmic Bazaar project, about this. And this goes back to Phil Tetlock's comment about policymakers care about big questions, but we can't forecast big questions. We can only forecast this subset of questions that's rigorously resolvable. And many view that as an artifact of the forecasting process, like a weakness in the forecasting tool. Like it has, the question has to be so in the weeds and specific. You have to articulate all the ways in which this would or wouldn't count. And Charlie was saying that he thinks that's wrong, and I agree with him, but he stated it much better than I ever had. I think we often, there are lots of hidden ambiguities about what we believe and what we communicate that we're usually never called to task on. And the requirement that something be forecastable requires that we identify those things. And so it forces a kind of clarity on the conversation that I think has its own benefits. And so in this process, I think many people are going to find the views that the stakeholders had on factors to be as or more interesting than the actual forecasts. So I think that's a lot of value. Also, once we break things down into a form that's amenable to quantitative analysis, forecasting tools are not the only tools we can apply. So I think in the process of coming up with these questions and packaging them for forecasting, we had to collect the historical data. We had to look at whether the historical data seemed to reflect the actual trend that we cared about. And that itself was enlightening. I mean, so we saw that when we're tracking the number of times Japan responds to Chinese military aircraft into its airspace, that it in fact coincides with tensions between China and Japan, and China's general aggressiveness. So in 2016, there was a big jump in Japanese responses that coincided with its decision to revise its constitution. And so and we can apply all kinds of other tools to these questions once we make them amenable to this kind of analysis. But then I also, of course, find that the forecasts themselves to be very enlightening. But in many respects, it's the carrot and then the cherry on top.
Yeah, absolutely. I totally agree in that. I think that process is useful for, almost any research question or any big question out there, right? Kind of breaking down into its components parts is often the part that is not given due weight and is probably the most important part. So I definitely agree with you on there. But it is a nice carrot. And I would say, I'm curious what, if we can think of this specific issue, was there one kind of disagreement that we found in this process or in this process of breaking down into the factors or even deeper into the metrics? What was the maybe most interesting to you or most surprising maybe disagreement you found amongst the stakeholders or between the stakeholders and the crowd on one of these metrics or within one of these factors?
So I think the military trust factor stood out as being one that really seemed to matter to people. I think it's probably the factor where there was the biggest general disagreement between the cohorts. And we had, that manifests in a couple metrics. The Gallup survey metric, of course, just captures general US sentiment about confidence in the military. But the lethal autonomous weapon question gets at a particular reason why, so let me just back up. Many of the stakeholders thought that the most likely reason that tensions would spike was that the U.S. would use computing technology, AI technology, in a controversial way. And the most likely manifestation of that was use of a lethal autonomous drone to assassinate somebody. And so that ended up being a common kind of lightning point for like what could make this relationship go off the rails. And we did in fact see a big forecast disagreement on that metric. So that I think is an example of where we've maybe zeroed in on something that matters. And seeing it actually reflect in the forecasts is really valuable.
Yeah, I definitely agree. And seeing, coming from our previous work, kind of asking people, how they feel, people actually involved in this relationship, how they feel. I think actually getting this broader picture of some of these factors that hadn't really been considered, it was definitely really, really useful. But I have to ask the question that I think is probably on everybody's mind, and that is, what is the future of the DOD-Silicon Valley relationship? And I'm curious what the state of the future of that relationship is according to stakeholders, according to the crowd, and according to Michael Page.
Well, I don't feel qualified to answer the latter question. So the stakeholders, a majority of them feel optimistic about the state of the relationship. But I should caveat that we didn't select the stakeholders to be representative of the expert population on this question. We could pick any arbitrary group, and we want to see if we could get under the hood on where they disagreed and what they thought. So I don't think we should put too much stock in that by itself, but you can put some stock in it. I mean, you can all look at the list of stakeholders and take from that what you want. The crowd's view was mixed on this question, and that's, I think, kind of what we would expect. I think that one of the reasons why I'm interested in combining the complementary strengths of experts and crowd judgment is that the experts obviously understand the big question much better. Like that's their job. That's something that you can't farm out to the crowd. And so when it comes to breaking down that big question into its constituent parts, that's something I think the experts are uniquely able to do. But when it comes to actually forecasting those component parts, I don't think that's necessarily the expert's comparative advantage. That's not what they are trained to do. That's not what they do most of the time. Obviously, there's not that many of them. And so, the crowd provides a complementary service here. I also expect, and I don't necessarily mean this is the case for this group, but in general, if you look at a policy debate, particularly a charged policy debate, people's views on the underlying factors are influenced by their overall views. So if you are pro single payer healthcare, you probably think it's going to cost less than if you're, and sorry, I should say if you're pro single payer healthcare because you think it's a human right to have healthcare, you probably also think it's going to cost less. And those two things ought to be uncorrelated. In fact, they are correlated. And that probably means that our views on the big question tends to trickle down and kind of bias our views on the smaller questions. And so I think that's why it's so useful to be able to punt the smaller questions to a larger, more diverse crowd that doesn't have that particular bias. Because of that, I'm not surprised that the crowd is kind of split the baby on a lot of these questions. So if you take some of the military trust questions, they came in between the two cohorts, and that probably, we can't say with any confidence why that was the case for this particular question. But I think theoretically, I might believe that one cohort would be like a bit more optimistic, one cohort would be a bit too pessimistic, and the crowd would come in somewhere in the middle. And that is probably the way it'll work in most contexts. So that didn't really answer your question. I don't know what the future of the relationship is. I hope everyone gets along, but I'm more interested in trying to understand how people think about these questions.
So then that leads me to potentially one last question, and that is, what other questions do you think that this approach could help us better understand or potentially answer? Yeah,
so I think virtually any question. So it's obviously the more important the question, the more resources it makes to invest in making sure we get the right answer. I think the best candidate questions are questions that people just disagree about in a way that seems intractable. And this could be, what is going to happen with like geopolitical dynamics in the South China Sea. This could be about whether immigration policy allowing more high-skilled foreign immigrants into the U.S. Will be like net good or net bad for the U.S.'s prowess in technical fields. I think those types of questions I often hear debated in very unproductive ways, where people are, that they have their view. It feels more like an identity view than like an empirical view. And I want to take those debates and put them in a less charged context, where we can slowly, carefully take them apart and send the component parts to a reliable forecasting tool, and all agree that we should pay like some due respect to the results that come back. And if we, I think, pre-agree that this is like a reasonable way to navigate these disagreements, I'm hoping we can kind of unjam some of these log jams.
Right. So the idea that maybe issues that maybe have very charged polls, if you will, or can be very divisive, that even if maybe individually, views on some of these on an issue or a question might be very polarizing, that this approach could actually maybe, even if kind of independent views are rather extreme or hardly deeply held, that this could help kind of find some middle ground, or at least highlight areas where maybe disagreement either is kind of not as big, if you will, as we thought it was, or is maybe we can kind of be informing so that, you know.
It's like when a couple goes to a relationship therapist. I mean, if we can find a reliable third-party mediator to help us move forward on some of these topics, that seems good. And in this context, what makes the mediator good is that empirically they're more correct than any other method we can find. And so my suggestion is not that we use the Foretell crowd all the time, or not that we use crowd forecasting all the time, but that we use the best probabilistic forecasting tool on important questions. And if policymakers can view the best probabilistic forecasting tool as a reliable relationship therapist, I think it could possibly help them move forward on otherwise intractable disagreements.
Well, I think you just have figured out the new tagline for Foretell. Couples therapy stand-in for.
That was not one I'd rehearsed, so we'll see how that lands.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much, Michael, for the presentation and for the Q&A. I want to thank everyone in the audience for the great questions. I hope we were able to get to all of them in some way or another. So thank you for the input and the questions. And we look forward to the forthcoming paper.
Thanks, Kat. Thanks, Lynn. Thanks, everyone, for showing up and for your interest in this project.
And on behalf of CSET, I'd like to thank you both, our speaker, Michael Page, our moderator, Dr. Catherine Aiken, Kat. And thanks too for everyone who joined us today and had such thought-provoking questions. If you'd like to learn more about CSET, please go to cset.georgetown.edu and sign up for our newsletter and our research updates. Our next webinar takes place on December 16th, when our speaker will be Ryan Fedashuk, discussing his recently released report for CSET, Harnessed Lightning, with retired Lieutenant General Jack Shanahan. He was the inaugural director of the U.S. Department of Defense Joint Artificial Intelligence Center, or JAIC. So join us then, and in the meantime, please stay safe, and we hope to see you again, if only virtually, real soon.